Hello, Year 10. We are carrying on with our theme of war poetry before we move on to the other themes that occur in the power and conflict cluster. And we're going to look this week at a poem that was written during the First World War, about the First World War. And obviously, that sort of First World War poetry is something that you have looked at every year in your time at Ruislip High in one way or another. You know, whether it's a longer, more detailed look at the sort of the context of the First World War, or whether it's kind of looking at one poem in a scheme of a sort of wider scheme of poetry. And it's because I think it's a very formative uh, sort of a turning point and almost a kind of a volta in itself for the art form of poetry in Britain. I really think that we can go so far as to say that. So the first thing we're going to do is I'll tell you the poem we're looking at. We're looking at Exposure by Wilfred Owen. And the first thing we're going to look at is the title itself. So exposure. So what does exposure mean? Well, much like Remains, exposure is a title that has deliberately got a variety of different meanings. Um, there is exposure to the truth. There is exposure to what reality is. You know, if you are exposed to something, it is something that you suddenly see for the first time, or you suddenly understand in a visceral, very real way. There's also exposure to the elements. Being exposed to something is to be vulnerable to it. So you could be exposed to the weather, and in fact, exposure is something that people die of. But we're going to see a little bit in a couple of minutes. We're going to see a little bit about um, the effects of cold weather, the sort of what someone might have been exposed to in the trenches. And we'll just look at exposure as a concept. Um, but I think that idea of being vulnerable to something through exposure, I think that's what exposure is. It's where you are vulnerable to something. You know, we think about that word exposed, and quite often, sort of it has connotations of not. It's almost like having no protection. No, not if you are exposed to something, it's the sense that there's nothing surrounding you. There's nothing between you and that thing, whatever that thing is. So I think that's really where the title kind of sits. Then we'll go on and we'll have a little look at what life in a trench was like. And I've got two different videos, two different clips. And one's from the History Channel, and one's from a film made by Peter Jackson quite recently, a kind of historical film rather than a fictionalized film. And they're both very useful, and they're both very different, and they're both are very sort of specific products of what they've been made for, if that makes any sense. Then we'll talk briefly about war poetry in general, why are war poems written and why specifically the First World War. And then we'll have a little look at Wilfred Owen himself. We'll have a little look at the poet and who he is, and maybe get an insight into why he's writing it and the way that he is. And then we'll have a look at the text. What I would say about looking at the text, though, is that as we progress, I'm going to try and be less and less specific about the actual annotations I want you to make on the page. I think as we go through, that's something you can work on more and more yourselves, and that's something that you can try and be a little bit more independent with. Of course, if people are stuck on particular things, or if someone goes, actually, this stanza didn't really make any sense to me, then I'm more than happy to make a little video specifically about individual stanzas. But I'm conscious of the fact that in this climate, we're missing our classroom environment and we're missing other people's ideas. So I don't want to just tell you everything about the poem and you to decide that's the only way to look at it. I also think it's really important as well that you do share your ideas with other people. So that English WhatsApp group that you set up before the school closed, share some ideas on there. What do you think about this metaphor? What do you think about this simile? Just make sure that you're using everything that you've got available to you. Message me on Google Classroom if you have any questions as well. Anyway, so let's watch this little video now about weather and about what exposure is.
The biggest things are the exposure of your skin to the cold. When it is extremely cold like now, your skin can actually freeze. And when your skin freezes, it actually acts very similarly to if you get a severe burn. The areas of your body that are prone to this would be your nose, your ears, your chin, your fingers, and your toes. But realistically, they're the areas that we often think, wow, these feel very cold. The blood flow can reduce when it's so cold. The blood vessels actually constrict or squeeze, and because of that, they aren't getting the normal amount of blood flow. After a while, that tissue can freeze, and to be honest, once it freezes completely, that we are not really able to reverse that entirely. If somebody does come in with frostbite, we try to minimize the tissue damage, but prevention is the biggest key of all.
What's a warning sign for somebody?
Pain. Pain is the warning sign. It hurts. Frostbite actually doesn't sneak up on people. It will realistically happen for one of two issues. If you power through it, because you just refuse to seek shelter, particularly if you're away from shelter, that can be an issue. Another thing that can happen is if you get stranded. Being stranded out in the cold, that can be devastating. If your car breaks down, for example, and you have no way to get help, that can be extremely dangerous. Unfortunately, you will know it's coming, and it's the people who generally don't have the ability to seek shelter and to get into a warm place that actually will suffer significant injury.
At what point do you know that you need to seek medical attention?
When you're continuing to have discomfort after you've been inside for several minutes. If you will often at the same time, you may see whitening of the affected areas, say for example your hands. If the fingertips are not returning to normal color after you've been inside for several minutes, then you need to be concerned, because there may be little to no blood flow to those parts of your body.
Okay, so a little bit there about what the cold weather can do to you, what exposure to the cold can do to you. I think what's important to remember as well, though, I put that in because I think there were a lot of lines in the poem that link very much to the cold weather that the soldiers had to face, but also that it's not just exposure to the cold that they're going through. We'll see when we listen to it, and when we start to read through it as well, we'll see that it's so much more than just about being exposed to cold weather. It's about being exposed to all weather. And then, of course, there's all those things we talked about when we were looking at the title, the other kind of things that one is exposed to in a more figurative sense, rather than just the weather, the truth, whatever unpleasant kind of emotional journeys they're going through. They're left vulnerable emotionally, physically, mentally, but also kind of strategically. They're vulnerable. They're sitting in a trench in a field. So I think we'll look at that a little bit more. What those things are, what those different aspects of the weather are when we look at it, when we look at the text itself. But now we're going to look at two very different sources. One is from the History Channel. And it's a little bit more kind of blockbustery. And the one that's from a film is from a film by Peter Jackson called They Shall Not Grow Old. And it was made, I think, in 2018. And it's sort of footage from the First World War with testimony from people who fought in it. And there's just a little bit of an insight in both of those videos into what it was like to live in the trenches. So we're going to look at that before we have a look at Wilfred Owen. So I'll put up a little title to introduce each video, and we'll go from there. Okay, fantastic.
Life in a trench, I'd like to explain in one word: horrific. It's mud, it's death, it's rats, it's stench, and soldiers develop an attitude in a trench that everybody is going to die.
Life in the trench was abysmal. There were several lines of trenches, and the front line trenches, of course, were the most dangerous because they were constantly under fire. Incoming!
The Germans dug assiduously, building dry, safe, and comfortable trenches for themselves with bunkers that actually had electricity and sometimes running water. The British and French, who were convinced that they were never going to be there for that long, didn't spend nearly the same effort. And so their trenches tended to be muddy and wet and not that safe.
Disease ran rampant. It was very difficult to get any sort of sleep, a decent hot meal, keep your clothes dry, and more importantly, to keep your sanity.
There were so many health problems of just simple disease that took much more men out of combat than direct fire.
I think one word that would surprise people about life in a trench: boredom. A lot of time is spent just sitting, cleaning tools, and being scared to death the battle's going to start any minute.
It was just the day-to-day monotony of being trapped in this very small space and fighting for a war that's really fought in inches.
The idea of open warfare, of fighting out into what they called no man's land, wasn't working. The technology of the war had advanced so much with machine guns, artillery that could lob shells a mile. It became mostly a defensive war early on, and as a defensive war, you wanted to protect your troops, so the miles and miles of trenches were built.
There were often bodies buried in the sides of trenches, bodies lying out in the open in front of the trenches. The soldiers were experiencing not only the war that they were fighting at the moment, but the war that had been going on throughout those trenches for all of the years of the war.
A young lieutenant writes his mother and says, "I haven't been killed yet, but it's only a matter of time." That's typical of the way soldiers felt about life in the trench. You just did it. You existed day to day, tried to go on, keep your chin up, but one day the bullet was going to have your name on it, and you were going to perish. You weren't going home.
Hello, Lieutenant. So, I previously said on this video that I was about to show you two different things, one from the History Channel and one from a film by Peter Jackson. But you will see from the image that I'm about to put up on the screen now that Warner Brothers have stopped me from showing you an excerpt from the Peter Jackson film, which is a shame. But I would thoroughly recommend that you watch it. It's called They Shall Not Grow Old. You can get it on Amazon Prime. I can't remember how much it is, but it's not massively expensive to rent. I would thoroughly recommend it. I'm sorry, that's Peppa Pig you can hear in the background. But I would thoroughly recommend watching it. I have instead found an interview with a soldier who fought in the First World War, and also a little bit from a BBC programme that a historian chap called Dan Snow did about life in the trenches in general. So I've included those two because they're very interesting, and they're also a bit of a counterpoint to what the History Channel kind of blockbustery one looks like. So hopefully those will be interesting, and I'm sorry that I wasn't able to beat Warner Brothers and let you see some of that film. Anyway, here we go.
I was 18 and a half. I was called up. I saw two battlefields, one at Passchendaele and one at Pilkem. I shall never forget it as long as I live. The officer was going down the trench. Anybody who didn't go in was shot on sight for cowardice. We went over and we crawled. If you stood up, you were dead. And I came across a Cornishman. He was ripped from his shoulder to his stomach with shrapnel. His inside was out on the ground in a pool of blood. He said, "Shoot me." Before we could draw a revolver to shoot him, he was beyond all human aid. He died. In 30 seconds he died, and he just said one word, "Mother." And that haunted me all my life. Out of the trench, there was about 4 or 5 Germans got out, and they didn't get out to run, they got out to fight. And one of them was coming towards us with a fixed bayonet. He couldn't have had any ammunition, or else he'd have shot us. As I say, I was a crack shot, I shot him in the shoulder. I couldn't kill him. That Cornishman's mother was in my brain. I thought, I can't kill him. He's somebody's son. He's probably got brothers and sisters. Maybe he's got a family to bring up. I can't kill him. I shall never forget it. We did 2 or 3 turns in the trenches, and we were going back on one of those turns when somebody pulled the lanyard of a gun, fired a whiz-bang, landed right in amongst us. It killed 3, 4, and 5. It wounded me. And piece of shrapnel, it must have hit something in the ground or something hard. It was 2 inches long, half an inch wide, jagged edge, hit me in the groin. It was only a scratch, really. You could see it. And I must have passed out. I don't know how long I lay there. The next thing I knew, I was in a dressing station. And the doctor came the next evening. I took the bandage off. He said, would you like me to take that shrapnel out? Now, he said, before you say yes, there's no anesthetic in the camp. So I thought for a minute. Thought, well, I don't know. The pain was intense. Says, yes, go on, getting out. How long will you be? He said, 2 minutes. I could have bloody killed him in those 2 minutes. But anyway, he got it out. And he said, do you want this as a souvenir? I said, I've had the bloody stuff long enough as it is. The next thing I knew, they called my number, my name. I was put in a Red Cross van down to Rouen and back to England. That was it.
So we're going to watch a little bit now. That's a sort of biography, a sort of film clip kind of biography of Wilfred Owen, to find out a little bit more about him and who he was, but also how much poetry meant to him. And then we'll have a look at a little bit of the poem. But as I say, I do want you to try and be a little bit more independent with the annotations from now on. So I'm going to point out a few things that I think are worth looking at, and I want you to kind of see if you can expand beyond those annotations. But anyway, here's the little film about Wilfred Owen.
Wilfred Owen came from a lower middle class background, 4 children to be brought up, so there was never any spare cash around. Owen was a committed poet from his late teens onwards. He was a great admirer of Keats and other romantics, Wordsworth in particular. And he knew from them that to be a poet was the greatest calling that anybody could possibly have, and he had never had any doubt that that's what he wanted to be. He was sent out to France at the beginning of 1917, and within 3 weeks he was in one of the most appalling circumstances one could possibly imagine, when he was sent into a German dugout in no man's land that had recently been captured as a British outpost, and he had to keep his platoon there for 50 hours, he says, under constant shell fire, expecting at any minute to be buried alive. The place was slowly flooding with rainwater, with the water rising above their knees, so that at any moment they might have been buried or drowned or just died of shock. They were then taken out for a short period, put back in again in a quite different situation on the top of a hill in very hard frost. So it had been heavy rain and mud, but now it was bitter frost, and they were out on the snow, exposed, unable to move. One man in his platoon froze to death, and he was eventually almost killed by a shell that dropped near his head while he was asleep, and he was blown into the air, and that finally broke his nerve.
In World War I, it was called shell shock. In World War II, it was called combat neurosis. And now it's called post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's all the same phenomenon. There will always be psychological injuries in war, just like there are always physical injuries. And the historical record is that they rise and fall together. What spills blood spills spirit.
I don't believe that the trauma of combat ever goes away, whether you win or lose the war. You know, my father used to wake up at night. I know plenty of World War II vets, the last good war, the war we won, the war that saved the whole world. I know plenty of them that still wake up nights. You don't go through things that are that unnatural, that are that unholy. You don't go through them unchanged.
Now, Wilfred Owen was already at Craig Lockhart, and he was suffering from shell shock. Sassoon, in a sense, undertook the tutelage of Owen. It was a wonderful good fortune of Owen's that he should have met Sassoon when he did, because Sassoon showed him how to find his own voice and to find his own subject.
I saw his round mouth's crimson deepen as it fell, like a sun in his last deep hour. Watched the magnificent recession of farewell, clouding, half gleam, half glower, and a last splendor burn the heavens of his cheek, and in his eyes the cold stars lighting, very old and bleak, in different skies.
People who have been through heavy fighting, where many people have died, seem to carry a kind of imprint of death on them, where the dead are more real to them than the living. Owen speaks of such people as the men whose minds the dead have ravaged.
Above all, I am not concerned with poetry. My subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity. All a poet can do today is warn. That is why true poets must be truthful.
He had to go back to the front to bear witness. And he says in one of his letters, I came out to lead these boys as well as an officer can, and to watch their sufferings that I may speak of them as well as a pleader can. And so he goes back so that he can testify to the horrors of the war. And I think he went knowing he wouldn't come back. They were trying to throw a pontoon bridge over a canal, and the Germans' machine guns were about 30 yards away. And these chaps were just carrying their pontoons, putting them in the river. And Owen went backwards and forwards between them, saying, "You're doing very well, my boy. Just move that a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. You're doing very well, you're doing very well." And then he was hit and killed.
"Oh, Jesus Christ, I'm hit," he said, and died. Whether he vainly cursed or prayed indeed, the bullets chirped. In vain, vain, vain. Machine guns chuckled. Tut, 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 tut. And the big gun guffawed. Another sighed. "Oh, mother, mother, dad," then smiled at nothing, childlike, being dead. And the lofty shrapnel cloud leisurely gestured, "Fool," and the splinters spat and tittered. "My love," one moaned. Love languid seemed his mood, till slowly lowered his whole face kissed the mud, and the bayonet's long teeth grinned. Rabbles of shells hooted and groaned, and the gas hissed.
As the bells were ringing for the armistice in Shrewsbury, where his parents lived, their front doorbell rang, bringing the telegram saying that he was killed.
I think Wilfred Owen is probably the archetype of a poet who comes in with a romantic feeling and just recoils at that horror, and probably writes the best war poetry of World War I.
I don't think there's another poet of the Great War to equal him.
True poets must be truthful.
So there's a little bit about Wilfred Owen there. I think there is an incredible poignancy about the fact that he is killed so close, so within touching distance of the end of the war. And that story about the bells ringing in Shrewsbury, and the front doorbell ringing in that little bit about his life there is incredibly touching. So we'll now just hear a reading of the poem by an actor, and then we'll have a look at the text itself.
Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low, drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessant to the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn, massing in the east her melancholy army, attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. But nothing happens. 7 successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance. But nothing happens. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassier ditches. And so we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? Slowly, our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires glowed with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs, shutters and doors all closed. And as the doors are closed, we turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever sun smile true on child or field or fruit. For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore not loath we lie out here, therefore we're born. For love of God seems dying. Tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shriveling many hands, puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party picks and shovels in shaking grasp, pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens.
So we've had that reading there, which I think is really important, because I think one of the things that I sort of want you to remember about the poem is that it is first person from someone who is in the trench. It's a dramatic monologue in the sense that the poetic voice is first person, but it's also sort of autobiographical. You know, here is someone directly relating their own experience. It's quite interesting because it's a kind of contrast to the Charge of the Light Brigade, because in the Charge of the Light Brigade you have someone who was not there writing about a very specific, dramatic, intense individual military moment, whereas here you have someone who was there who's not writing about one specific particular military movement. They're sort of writing a poem about the overall military experience. But there are a few things that I want to pick up on. So the first thing I want to look at is the ends of the stanzas. if we just look at what all of those lines are on all of the stanzas, read them out in order. If we have a look, we've got, but nothing happens. What are we doing here? But nothing happens. But nothing happens. Is it that we are dying? We turn back to our dying, for love of God seems dying, and but nothing happens. So, in a strange way, the ends of the stanzas are actually, they're sort of actually telling the entire story. They're a kind of summary of what happens. The majority of the endings are but nothing happens. And I think this the word but is particularly interesting in that, and also the word nothing and its connection to the verb as well, because I think the word but, I can't remember who it was who said it. It's a very, very good quote. Mr. Reynolds reminded me of it a few weeks before we finished at school, and it was that the word but negates absolutely everything that comes before it. So I think that's quite interesting, because in a way that's what he's saying all of this stuff happens, all of this kind of drama here, but nothing happens. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. So the salient is kind of the bit that sticks out. So if you think about the trenches, it might be that the trench kind of sticks out like that. And this is the salient, the kind of the bit that sticks out there. And it's sort of like this idea that the flares are kind of, the soldiers are losing track of where they are and what's actually happening. But it doesn't matter, because nothing happens. And so much of this is about them sitting in the trench and dealing with these horrific conditions while nothing happens. There's also this questioning, sort of, what are we doing here? And then later on, is it that we are dying? This sort of questioning of what they're doing there, why they're there, but also what is actually happening. And I think, is it that we are dying is quite interesting, because of course Wilfred Owen, he does die in the war. But I think what he's sort of asking with that question, when he asks, is it that we are dying, is he's saying, is this part of the inevitable process, what we're going through now, the sitting around, is that part of dying? And again, on the other side here, this questioning of life and this questioning of society comes in, because it's for love of God seems dying. We turn back to our dying, and here, this is again, it's sort of got two meanings deliberately. It's the act of dying. So it's, we turn back to our dying as if we turn back to carry on dying. But there's also, we turn back to dying as in the people that are dying. It's, we turn back to them to look after them. In fact, all of them are dying. So I think there's something in that, and I think the ends of the stanzas are particularly interesting. The other thing I want to focus on is the references to nature, because obviously if we include weather, we're looking at a huge kind of reference to nature throughout the poem all the way through. So we have the merciless iced east winds that knive us. What else have we got? The mad gusts, twitching agonies meant among its brambles. Northern says the flickering gunnery rumbles far off like a dull rumour of some other war. The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know that war lasts, rain soaks, clouds sag stormy, dawn massing in the east. Now we're going to come back to this line in particular. I'm going to highlight this section here, because I want to talk about this as a kind of focal point for the references to nature in general. So, sudden successive flights of bullets. Now, the reason I'm doing this, the reason I'm saying this is like nature, is because it is as if the bullets are sort of flocks of birds. It's not someone shoots. It's not sudden successive, shots fired by the Germans. It's flights of bullets, as if the bullets are animals that live in the wild as well. And that's kind of really what these references to nature are. Less deadly than the air. Shudders black with snow. Sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. We watch them wandering up. So actually all the way through, pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. What we have all the way through is we have the personification of nature. We have crickets jingling for hours. The innocent mice rejoice. I mean, who are the innocent mice there? It's an interesting question. You know, the house is theirs. Is it that they feel safe now and they are the innocent mice, or is it genuinely that the mice are enjoying this absence of people? Since we believe not otherwise, can kind fires burn, nor ever sun smile true on child or field or fruit. For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid, therefore not loath we lie out here, therefore we're born. So he's sort of saying as if this was their very purpose, this death. This is why they're here, you know, that life is unfair and life is pointless, and this thing of love of God seems dying. There's a real question here at the heart of the sort of the point of this for Wilfred Owen. And again, here, tonight this frost will fasten on us. Will fasten on this mud and us. So the frost will fasten on this mud and us. And again, it's this mud and us. It's as if all these different things are part of nature. You know, the soldiers are part of the landscape almost. They're the same as mud. They're nothing. They're not people anymore. All their eyes are ice. You know, paws over half-turned faces. All their eyes are ice. This stanza here is really interesting in relation to that video I put on here about cold weather, because this is about, you know, whether or not this is the burial party, so the people that are going out, or whether it's the dead bodies. The flesh is freezing, shriveling many hands, puckering foreheads crisp. This isn't differentiating between dead soldiers and live soldiers. So this continued personification of nature then is quite interesting. Let's go back here to the front. So there's a particular thing. It's not just personifying nature. It's actually doing something else as well. It's kind of going a step beyond personification. So I'm going to put personification here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little arrow, because there's actually another word that I want you to consider, and it's this word. Agency. Now, the reason I'm looking at this word agency here is because all of these kind of references to nature all the way through, the weather, nature, the animals, even here, the flights of bullets, they all have what we call agency. Agency is basically being, if you think about, you know, James Bond, it's being in charge of the action. The agent is the thing that's in charge of the action. So our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. The east winds are stabbing them. The east winds are knifing them. They are kind of being attacked by the winds. It's not that the wind just happens to be cold. It's that the wind is actively, with agency, attacking them. The mad gusts tugging on the wire. That, you know, sort of the wind is kind of aggressively attacking the barbed wire. And again, you know, sort of the wire being like brambles. Men, barbed wire, shells, bullets, all of these things become part of the natural surroundings. The wire, the bullets, the shells, the noise. And here, when we have far off like a dull rumour of some other war, it's almost as if the war is kind of, they don't know anything other than war. You know, some other, that's just a dull rumour of some other war, as if what they have here and now in front of them is the only thing. But I want you to go through the poem and look for this agency, because we see it everywhere, all the way through. The pale flakes of snow down here that come feeling for our faces. You know, the snow isn't just landing on their faces, making them feel cold. The snow is trying to get to their faces. The snow is actively seeking their faces out. So that's another thing to look for in your annotations, is where there are references to nature, where nature's been personified, where nature has agency, and the crossover between nature and the artificial world, and how war and nature seem to become one. I want to particularly focus a little bit on this here. So Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army. So Dawn, this idea of Dawn being a her, has possibly got some links to the concept of Mother Nature. And there's also something as well about a feminine presence in what was an entirely masculine one. There's something interesting about Wilfred Owen's use of gender there, whether it's Mother Nature, whether it's the idea maybe whether he's making some sort of very kind of feminist point about how the male kind of attitude to war is not particularly effective. Not 100% sure really, but there's a variety of different ways of interpreting that. It's this bit here as well. Attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. So Dawn's melancholy army is either clouds that are sagging stormy, or it's the Germans, because grey specifically is the colour of German, or more correctly Austro-Hungarian uniforms. So are these shivering ranks of grey on grey, are they the Germans advancing, or are they clouds, or does it even matter? Mainly, does it matter? Because nothing happens. But also, the question of does it really matter is being asked, because, well, either way, they're going to be attacked, aren't they? Either way, there's an army coming towards them. Whether the army is the deadly snow that will kill them, that will freeze them to death, whether it's the sun that will destroy them, whether whatever it is, whether it's a bullet or a frost that kills you, it makes no difference. And that's really what Owen is saying. And actually, I would say as well, it's worth looking at all the references to death and dying all the way through, because from the very beginning, you could even say, "Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent." It's interesting because they're kept awake by the silence. There's something in the absence of noise, of silence, that is in some way that the night is silent. There's some sort of this sibilance here, silent, salient, flares confuse our memory of the salient, worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous. These repeated S, it's to do with the silence, but it's also it's already kind of coming to a close. The continued use of ellipses is almost a kind of structural metaphor for death. Things just tailing off, just petering out, just slowly disappearing. And I really do think that that's something that Owen's doing. So just to kind of clarify one more time, the things that I would like you to really look for when you're going through and you're annotating beyond what we've done, I think I really want you to look at this, focus on the end of the stanzas, but focus on nature, specifically personification and agency, and focus on references to death, and think about nature and nature's relationship to war. How is nature involved in the war? Does nature play a part in the war? So hopefully that that kind of gets you started. I don't want to go through every single line, go through everything, every single stanza for you. I feel like it's important now that you kind of have a go at doing that, yourself. Look back through the previous videos, look back through your previous annotations, look at the kind of things that we're looking for, look at those poetic techniques that we're looking for. Feel free to ask me any questions on Google Classroom, but I want you to kind of take a little bit more ownership of that now. And if you do feel like you want a bit more of a challenge, if you look in the Google slides that I shared with you that says that is consolidation PRA, there'll be a page for exposure, all about it, in the same way that you've done for the other 3 poems for this week's set of tasks. So have a go at doing that for exposure as well. And yes, just get in contact if you're struggling, or if you want any more pointers or anything at all. I'm happy to carry on making these if they are useful. A few of you have got back to me and said that they are, but there's some people I've not heard from, and I just want to make sure everyone is at least watching these videos, because they take a while to make. I really don't mind doing it at all. It really is a real pleasure. But just keep letting me know that they're worth doing, or if there's something about them that doesn't work, tell me, and then I can change them and I can do a different format. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that, and I look forward to making next week's one.